Welcome to the program. We're still in the epistle of Paul to the Philippians, and I'm dealing with chapter 3. So it begins like this, and I like the way that Paul is speaking when he says, finally, my brethren. It's not final in that sense that most people think that's the end of everything. It's really, he's coming to the conclusion of what he's been speaking about in the previous chapters. So he says, finally, he says, rejoice in the Lord. Well, living in an age that we do, where nations are torn apart. It's just today that in Britain we've seen the Prime Minister having to resign. In Germany, the present leader, the Chancellor, is extremely unpopular. And the same in France, with Macron, who, although he was recently re-elected, has lost his majority in the parliament. And what it does show is that there is a turmoil. In fact, I will be talking about this in a different program later today, because I don't think outside of genuine war that, when I say genuine war, I mean world war, that we've seen quite such a disturbing uncertainty in every aspect. A lot of it, of course, has come about as a result of the Ukraine war, but it's deeper than that, because there is an uncertainty in politics, in the economics, and in every aspect that we don't see many countries. I mean, even America, the president in America is, I think at the moment, the most unpopular they've ever had. So there's a lack of real leadership in the free world, if I can put it in that way. And it's all the more reason that we need to turn to Scripture to find some of the answers. And it's interesting that on a difficult day in Britain, I'm reading Rejoice in the Lord. Well, that's the only person we can rejoice in at the moment. Then he goes on to write the same things to you is not grievous. Now, Paul is having to lay down various strong principles. Remember, that's what's very interesting about the New Testament is the New Testament's completely different to the Old. The Old is very historical, and of course we learn an awful lot from it. But in the New Testament, what is actually happening is the New Testament opens with the four Gospels, which are dealing purely with the life and ministry of Jesus. You open with the Acts of the Apostles, which is the story of the development of the early church. But in Paul's epistles, you've got the foundational teaching for the church. And so much of what we do today is based on the apostolic doctrine as taught in the New Testament. And so Paul is commenting by saying, it's hard for me to say some of these things, but it's an encouragement to you, because in verse 2 he goes on, and by the way, I'm dealing with the authorized version. I prefer to preach from the authorized version because there are so many other versions, it becomes confusing. But he goes on to say, beware of dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of, when he says in the authorized versions concision, in the other versions it's circumcision, he's warning to be aware of these things. And he comes on quite strongly to indicate that even at this phase of the church, there are people within the church who are not the right kind of leaders, but are in the church and even preaching for their own personal motives. But we'll see a bit more about that in a moment. But he goes on to say in verse 3, we are the circumcision which worship God in the Spirit. You see, to the Jew, circumcision was a legal issue, and there are strong spiritual reasons for it. But in the Christian church, amongst the new believers, circumcision was not a requisite. But Paul puts it elsewhere very strongly that spiritual circumcision is cutting oneself off from the works and the things of the flesh. So to us, while we don't have a physical circumcision, we need a spiritual circumcision, cutting ourselves off from things which would defile us in the flesh. And so he goes on, and we who worship God in the Spirit and rejoice in Jesus Christ and have no confidence in the flesh, that's circumcision to us. And he goes on in verse 4. You see, he needs to bring in what he's saying in verse 4, because to the Jew, Jewishness was obeying a set of rules. You were a Jew, and you observed the Sabbath, you had circumcision, and you had various other Jewish laws. But Paul is saying, though, he himself says, I might have confidence in that flesh, in those human things, because if any other man thinks that he's got what one could call, what Paul calls fleshly, but personal, material issues to bring salvation, Paul is so strict. And in verse 5, you've just got to look, because Paul was Jewish right through, because he says in verse 5, he was circumcised the 8th day, he was an Israelite, he was from the tribe of Benjamin, he was a Hebrew of the Hebrews. As touching the law, he was even a Pharisee. So, according to Jewish tradition, Paul was in the aristocracy. Paul was fully conforming to everything that the law demanded for salvation. He goes even further in verse 6, because he says, concerning zeal, he was persecuting the church. And we know that the beginning of Paul was in his Jewish zeal, he was persecuting the church. Sadly, we find out that to a certain extent today, that the Orthodox Jews are persecuting the church. We're wrong. And that's what he's saying here. He was at the highest level of Jewishness because he persecuted the church, and according to the law, he was blameless even in that. And we know that Paul was arresting Jews. I mean, that's what, when he was converted on the road to Damascus, he was going to Damascus to arrest and imprison the Christians. And it even tells us that his first introduction to this was that when the first martyr, Stephen, was being stoned, that while Paul didn't actually throw the stones, Paul incited them, possibly set the whole thing up, and actually held the clothes of those throwing the stones. In other words, he was literally participating and urging them on in order to fulfill the Jewish law. So he says, Verse 6, concerning zeal and persecuting the church, touching the righteousness which is of the law, he was blameless. But in verse 7, but what things were gain to me, I counted loss for Christ. So when you come to Christ, all those earthly attributes are valueless.